Hello, class. Welcome to A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me today. Did you know that the First Continental Congress met at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, not Independence Hall? That most of the men at the First Continental Congress had only heard of each other, but in fact had never met each other. And that this Congress, on paper, had zero legal authority to really do anything? Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will learn that and more in episode 49, the First Continental Congress. Hello and welcome to class. A few updates for the pod before we get into our lesson today on the First Continental Congress. Update number 1. I chose 2 winners of the bobblehead contest. Thank you so much for everyone that went to the website, www.ateachershistory.com, and entered their name in for the bobblehead sweepstakes, so to speak. The first winner, or winners, I guess, are Rachel and Jonah Edwards. And the second is Pedro Valdez Hernandez. I've shot you both an email, and if you could just let me know which president or founding father you'd like a bobblehead of, I will get that sent over to you ASAP. Additionally, as I've mentioned for the past couple weeks, next week's episode, or I should say next episode, it will drop on July 4th, Independence Day, episode 50, is a Q&A. And the winner of the guest host sweepstakes is John Tagliarani. And I'm really looking forward to recording an episode with John, Zach, Bill, and myself for episode 50, the question and answer episode. If you could, go to Twitter, find me at A Teacher's Hist. Find our Facebook page, Teacher's History Podcast, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com, and let me know what questions you have for myself, Bill, or Zach. And John will be the guest host asking us the questions. It should really be a lot of fun, and you'll get a sneak peek into each of us as individuals and into the creation of this podcast. Looking ahead, episode 51 will be a unit review. And remember, we'll go to weekly episodes from here on out. It will be a unit review of everything we've covered up to this point to catch you up before we dive into the revolution. And then Bill, hopefully Bill will be joining me. I think he will for episode 52 and 53, which will be the what's what and the who's who of the American Revolution, which will give you sort of a 40,000-foot view on the events of the Revolution and the people of the Revolution. So you have some context as we dive into the events of Lexington and Concord and the shots heard around the world that kick off the fighting. And lastly, we'll be announcing a couple more things on episode 50 in our next episode. But if you could, go to the website, www.ateachershistory.com, and check it out. This is something that I made by myself, but we will be upgrading the website in the next week or two. And I'd love for you to be able to get sort of a before and after. By the time episode 50 comes out, the website will be updated. So if you could check that out. And I will let you know episode 50 why. And I think that is it for the housekeeping. So let's dive into class today. And I want to briefly provide context for our lesson. Last episode, I spoke about the experience that Ben Franklin had in Parliament and how other colonies responded to the execution of the Intolerable Acts and the circular letters sent around by Massachusetts, and how they began to slowly coalesce around the idea of creating a response to Parliament and the King. And today, we will be covering what that response was and how the colonists came together to create it. So the colonists gathered in the fall of 1774 in Philadelphia for the first gathering of the Continental Congress. Now, Edmund Pendleton, a moderate member of Virginia's House of Burgesses, learned about the shutting down of the Boston harbor and the occupation of the city of Boston, and declared that though it should be granted that the Bostonians did wrong in destroying the tea, yet the Parliament giving judgment and sending ships and troops to punish the entire city in a case of private property is an attack upon constitutional rights, of which we could not remain idle spectators. The sentiment from Pendleton was shared by many colonists, as we got into a bit last episode and will continue to talk about today. And many colonies began to float the idea of gathering for some type of congressional Congress. And, like I mentioned, in the fall of 1774, they did just that, with 12 of the 13 colonies gathering in Philadelphia to create a unified, well, almost unified, Georgia sent no one, response to the actions of Parliament and the King. They met from September 5th to October 26th. And like I mentioned, the colony of Georgia was the only colony not to send a delegation of representatives. Now, those in Georgia at least had a bit of an excuse. They were having skirmishes and fights with natives, and they really needed the financial and material support from Great Britain. So they were not really in the mood to gather to discuss how to respond to the shutting down of the Boston port, because, to be honest with you, most in Georgia really didn't care. As I mentioned in the teaser of the episode, the congressional representatives, or I should say the colonial representatives, met in Carpenter's Hall, which at this time was where the city's builders met. And this hall had just been finished. It wasn't even officially open yet. They were just putting the final touches on this. Bill and I actually went to Carpenter's Hall a few weeks ago when we traveled to Philadelphia, and it was a beautiful building. It's located in the Old City neighborhood in Philadelphia, and it's interesting to note because it's right down the street from Independence Hall. Now, the colonists did not want to meet at the much more famous Independence Hall for their first gathering, and I'll talk more about that later in the episode. So they met at Carpenter's Hall. Now, they will meet at Independence Hall for the gathering of the Second Continental Congress, which, of course, is where they write the Declaration of Independence. Now, Carpenter's Hall was, as I mentioned, recently constructed, and it was really small. So these delegates, if we talk about the First Continental Congress, you can imagine them. They were basically almost on top of each other. I mean, they were crammed into really tight quarters. When I walked into Carpenter's Hall, I was blown away by just how small it was, imagining 50-plus men in there trying to deliberate and debate these topics. It just seemed almost strange. And the major reason why they met in Carpenter's Hall as opposed to Independence Hall was because Independence Hall was where the conservative Pennsylvania Assembly was meeting, and these men really wanted to avoid having to deal with the Pennsylvania Assembly. Now, Massachusetts and those representatives from Massachusetts were at the center of this dispute with Britain, and everyone knew that. But the delegates from Philadelphia chose Peyton Randolph, and he was the Speaker of the House of Burgesses in Virginia. And this was a politically shrewd choice. Peyton Randolph, when I say they chose him to be the president of the First Continental Congress. And he was from Williamsburg, Virginia. He was universally admired by Virginians, and this helped to sow goodwill among the Southern delegates from those in New England and in the North. The delegates knew that something needed to be done here, but there were varying degrees of actions that the members were considering. You had your conservatives, or even conservative moderates, who were led by men like Joseph Galloway, who we'll talk more about in a few minutes, John Dickinson, the author of the Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer, and John Jay, the future Supreme Court Chief Justice and co-author of the Federalist Papers. These men wanted to find some type of reconciliation between Great Britain and the colonies. On the other hand, you had more radical minds, men such as Sam and John Adams, who we're very familiar with at this point. Patrick Henry, of the Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death fame. And by the way, he hadn't said that yet. That comes in the March of 1775, and we'll cover that towards the end of the episode. And Roger Sherman, who we will talk more about as this podcast goes on, but he is one of the men responsible for the Declaration of Independence and the only man who signed all 4 of the great state documents: the Continental Association, here at the First Continental Congress, the Declaration at the Second Continental Congress, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. Most of the conservatives and moderates came from the middle colonies, while many of the more radical members hailed from New England and the southern colonies like Virginia and South Carolina. So think about how cool this must have been. John Adams, had never been more than 100 miles from his home in Braintree, Massachusetts. It took him 2 weeks to get all the way down to Philadelphia. It must have been surreal for many of these men to be meeting for the first time and even traveling to Philadelphia for the first time. I mean, these are some big-time players in the Revolutionary era that we're talking about. Oh, and did I mention that John Hancock and George Washington were there also? Now, as you can imagine, although it's usually viewed as these revolutionary minds all being on the same page all the time, they certainly were not. They could not at all relate to each other. They had never met each other. They were from different regions of the colonies and lived totally different lives. But they decided to come together for this event to determine what they were going to do, whether they were going to support Boston and Massachusetts, and if they were going to do that, how. The representatives decided that they would choose on how votes were to be allocated. Of course, those in Virginia said it should be based on population, but others, like in small colonies like Rhode Island, said that it should be equality. And that's what they ended up doing. 1 vote per colony. And although colonies sent delegations of men to the First Continental Congress, they figured they would just use a majority rules to determine how the vote would be cast. One last thing to note before we get into the actions that took place here at the First Continental Congress. It's often believed by many, at least when I would teach this, many of my students would already be of the mind that in the fall of 1774, right, just months before the outbreak of violence at Lexington and Concord, many of these men already had revolution in their mind. And while Samuel Adams reportedly did, and John Adams may have, for the most part, these men did not. They wanted no part of independence. George Washington, in a letter to Robert Mackenzie, written on October 9th of 1774, said as much. He said to Robert, quote, "Forgive me lead to add, and I think I can announce it as a fact, that it is not the wish or interest of that government or any other upon this continent, separately or collectively, to set up for independency. But this you may at the same time rely on, that none of them will ever submit to the loss of those valuable rights and privileges, which are essential to the happiness of every free state, and without which life, liberty, and property are rendered totally insecure." As you can see here, George Washington's clearly stating that no, these men are not arguing for independence, nor are they seeking independence, but you will be damned if they allow any of their essential rights of life, liberty, and property to be taken from them. Just a few days after the First Continental Congress gathered, on September 9th, they endorsed the Suffolk Resolutions, which we talked about last episode. At this point, they were focusing on how to respond to the intolerable acts, and they got word about a week later that many of the colonists in Massachusetts were more or less a political standoff with the ruling officials in Boston. About 2 weeks into the gathering of the First Continental Congress, John Adams informed his wife Abigail that the mood of the Congress was clear. He wrote, quote, "Congress will, to all present appearance, be well united. A Tory here is the most despicable animal. The spirit, the firmness, the prudence of Massachusetts are vastly applauded, and we are universally acknowledged as the saviors and defenders of American liberty." Now, was this totally accurate? Probably not. But it does show that John Adams genuinely believes that there is a significant amount of support for the radicals from Massachusetts. Much to the surprise of many of these moderates and even some of the conservatives throughout much of the deliberations, those radicals in New England didn't speak that much, and instead allowed the more radical-leaning men from Virginia and South Carolina to more or less speak on their behalf. The most notable conservative, though, who was standing in the way of these radicals accomplishing what they had hoped to accomplish, was none other than Joseph Galloway. He was born in Maryland, but represented Pennsylvania. And so, as a Marylander, we are taking no blame for Joseph Galloway. He more or less was an apologist for the crown, and stated that not only were the acts passed by Parliament justified, but the colonists more or less deserved to be taxed and should be happy to oblige given everything Britain had done for them up to this point. Joseph Galloway will pop up in our narrative in just a few more minutes when he proposes probably the most substantial plan from the Congress. But in late September, early October, before Galloway had proposed his Grand Council of Colonies, men like Richard Henry Lee and John Adams were actually calling for some type of militant measures, gathering militia to defend themselves, and men like Patrick Henry supported them. Henry argued, "A preparation for war is necessary to obtain peace. America is not now in a state of peace. All of the bulwarks of our safety, of our Constitution, are thrown down, and we are now in a state of nature. We ought to ask ourselves the question, should the plans of non-exportation and non-importation fail of success? In that case, arms are necessary. And if then, it is necessary now." But look, as I'm sure you can imagine, not everyone was in favor of this approach and thought it to be too drastic. The Virginian Benjamin Harrison contended that the resolutions of Mr. Adams and Mr. Lee, quote, "will tend only to irritate, whereas our business here is to reconcile." So, speaking of reconciliation, let's get back to Mr. Joseph Galloway. As I mentioned, Galloway was representing Pennsylvania, and he was seeking reconciliation. He wanted to figure out a way for the colonies to get representation in Parliament, but to be honest with you, by this point, that really wasn't even much of a consideration to many colonists. It was more or less understood by this time that any colonial representatives were not going to have enough influence in Parliament to effectively change or pass any legislation, so Galloway instead went in another direction. He proposed the creation of a Grand Council of Colonies. This would effectively be a colonial Congress that would carry veto power. The problem? Well, this was actually a pretty reasonable proposal, and the radicals in Congress were worried that it may pick up too much support, which would more or less effectively kill their plans to legitimize colonial assemblies. Fortunately for the radicals, this idea failed to pass by a close vote of 6-5. In all, John Adams thought much of this Congress was a show and vanity, bemoaning how each man wanted to show his intellectual might to the rest of the room. In a letter to Abigail, John noted that, quote, "I am worried to death with the life I lead. The business of the Congress is tedious, beyond expression. This assembly is like no other that ever existed, Every man in it is a great man, an orator, a critic, a statesman, and therefore every man, upon every question, must show his oratory, his criticism, and his political abilities. The consequence of this is that business is drawn and spun out to an immeasurable length. I believe that if it was moved and seconded that we should come to a resolution that 3 and 2 make 5, we should be entertained with logic and rhetoric, law, history, politics, and mathematics concerning the subject for 2 whole days, and then we should pass a resolution unanimously in the affirmative that 3 and 2 make 5. As you can see here, based on the letters from John Adams to Abigail, much of the gathering, at least in his opinion, was just the men showing off how smart they were and how much they knew. But a month and a half after gathering, they finally came up with something substantial. On October 14, 1774, the First Continental Congress passed the Declaration and Resolves. And they said a few different things here. Number 1, they have the right to life, liberty, and property. These, of course, are ideas taken by John Locke. They also said, since they're the descendants from England, they should have and do have rights of Englishmen, and that moving to the colonies did not forfeit those rights. Therefore, they concluded, they deserve the fundamental rights of representation in the colonial legislatures. They said that the king had the right to veto the laws, but they likely said this knowing that vetoes were incredibly rare. They did concede the fact that Parliament could regulate trade outside of the colonies. But then they also said they have the right to trial by jury, where the crime was committed, and not to be shipped back to England if accused. They held the right to assemble, petition the king, and should not have to deal with standing armies in their hometowns and cities. Then they said that elected councils should be the only legitimate councils, not appointed councils, because this was a clear violation of the separation of powers. In the end, the representatives of the First Continental Congress created a Continental Association. They petitioned the king, and they mentioned all of these complaints they had about how things were being run in the colonies. And then they declared that a boycott of British goods and the discontinuation of the slave trade were approved for December 1st, 1774. If Parliament persisted with the oppressive, intolerable acts against Massachusetts, a ban on all colonial exports to Britain would follow on September 1st of 1775. Now, Congress also called on their fellow colonists to start to be more frugal and industrious. That way they didn't have to rely on trade with Britain. And they recommended that they cut out things like horse racing and gambling, dances, and even plays. Committees were authorized in every county, city, and town to enforce these provisions. But now here's the catch. If Parliament could not legislate on behalf of the colonies, then who gave authority for the Continental Congress to tell the local colonial legislatures what to do? These were drastic measures proposed by the Continental Congress. Ending exportation of goods and importation of goods from Britain, canceling the slave trade. I mean, these were a big deal. Heck, the New York Colonial Assembly rejected it. They refused to go along with this, and they did not recognize the authority of the First Continental Congress. The non-exportation was especially concerning to the southern colonies, and even though it said it wouldn't be inactive for about a year, it was a hard pill to swallow. The idea behind all of this is that the colonies were calling Great Britain's bluff, and they believed that if Britain had to cut off all trade with the colonies, not just to Massachusetts, they could create a more favorable bargaining position. Finally, Congress wrote a petition to the king, likely written by John Dickinson. It was a request that the intolerable acts be repealed, and it was sent off to King George. In the end, the First Continental Congress had written out their petition and sent it to the king and parliament, and then they threatened non-importation and exportation and canceling the slave trade in order to try to leverage some type of revolution with Great Britain. As these proceedings were winding down on October 20th, and I bring this up because I think it's such an interesting thing to note in John Adams' journal. He dined with the entire rest of the Continental Congress at the City Tavern in Philadelphia, and this was at the invitation of Pennsylvania's House of Representatives. The whole House dined with them, quote, making near 100 guests in the whole elegant entertainment. A sentiment was given. May the sword of the parent never be stained with the blood of her children. 2 or 3 broad brims over against me at a table. One of them said, "This is not a toast but a prayer. Come, let us join in it." And they took their glasses accordingly. So broad brims was actually a slang term for Quaker. But that quote always stuck with me. May the sword of the parent never be stained with the blood of her children. On October 26th, the Congress officially disbanded after a couple months of work and were determined to meet again the following spring, May 10th, 1775, to discuss the reaction of King and Parliament to their petition. Patrick Henry famously said, quote, "British oppression has effaced the boundaries of the several colonies. The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American." Now, notice the date of the Second Continental Congress, May 10th, 1775. Well, Lexington and Concord happened on April 19th, 1775. So the Second Continental Congress is going to take on an entirely new energy than the first. So what happens between the First Continental Congress and the shots heard around the world on April 19th at Lexington and Concord? Well, Parliament received the Declaration and Resolves in January of 1775, and it confirmed what those in Parliament already suspected, that the colonists, at least in their minds, were basically in a state of quasi-rebellion. Keep in mind, many in Parliament believed that this Continental Congress wasn't even worthy of being negotiated with because they were illegitimate in the first place. Having read the colonist petition, Lord North sent word to Thomas Gage, who now at this point is the governor of Massachusetts, to seize the arms in the colonial hands and arrest the leaders. Now, as you likely have assumed, these orders don't arrive until later, April of 1775. March of 1775, a month prior to Lexington and Concord, Virginia holds a convention to determine whether they will accept the resolutions of the Continental Congress. And Patrick Henry, yes, that Patrick Henry, stands up before his colleagues in Virginia and utters his famous phrase at the end of his speech. Quote, "Gentlemen may cry peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war has actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? If life so dear or peace so sweet is to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery, forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." In the end, the Virginia Convention was convinced. Great Britain hears of this and suspends the House of Burgesses in Virginia. As you pack up your things, I'd like you to keep in mind that quote that John Adams mentioned in his diary from October 20th, 1774. May the sword of the parent never be stained with the blood of her children. Now, he doesn't credit that toast to anyone in particular, But one thing that's important to keep in mind as we move toward the revolution here is that many in Parliament were personally offended by the gathering of the First Continental Congress. And throughout these years, this past decade of action, they've been surprised and disappointed by the actions of many of the colonies. It was quite similar to a parent feeling betrayed by a child. Some took this personally. They were upset by how bad things had gotten in the colonies, and they didn't know exactly what to do next. Everything they had tried up to this point had backfired on them, and they were scrambling to figure out how to resolve this issue if it wasn't too late. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed. Please don't forget, next episode is our Q&A. So hit me up on Twitter @ateachershift or on Facebook, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com, to pose questions for our Q&A episode. Check out the website so you can see the relaunching of the website for our July 4th episode. And if you haven't left a rating and review on iTunes, that would be greatly appreciated. All right, see you next episode.